Welcome back everybody to another Nano Reef Freak video. In today's video I want to talk about new tanks versus old tanks, what to expect, and some challenges you might face with a new tank versus some challenges you might face with an old tank. Just want to give you guys a heads up on this video. It's just my thoughts right off the top of my head. There's very little organization, so please just bear with me and keep that in mind, and thank you all for watching. So here is our newly set up Eshup's Decimate 9-gallon Florida aquarium. It's almost 4 weeks old, and so far this tank only requires us to scrub some algae off the glass each week, and all the fish and corals are doing great. With new tanks, you have a lot of benefits. Once you're done with that cycle, you have things like aragonite sand, which are going to help balance your pH out. You've also got all new water in here for the most part, and the nutrients haven't been taken up by corals, so there's not really any need to test your calcium, magnesium, or things like that. Really, all you need to balance is make sure your pH is at 8, and make sure that your alkalinity is stable. Now let's talk about the challenges you'll face with a new tank like this. First, your DKH, aka your alkalinity, is going to be all over the place. Some days your alkalinity might be 7.1, other days you might dose and it might rise up to 8.0. I try and keep mine between 8 to 9, so usually my established tanks will sit around like 8.8, 8.6, somewhere in there. But on a new tank, that alkalinity is going to be pretty unstable for the first month or two. Another challenge you're going to face with a new tank is you're going to want to fill it with fish. We all get a little too excited when we're shopping for fish for our aquariums, so although your tank has cycled, that doesn't necessarily mean that all your live rock has turned into established live rock, and it doesn't mean that all your sand has turned into an established sand bed. There might be enough bacteria in there to support 1 or 2 fish in the beginning, but some people will go out there and try and buy 4 or 5 fish really quickly within the first month, and that will result in disaster in most cases. The other problem you're going to face with a new tank, especially smaller ones like this, not everybody has the equipment like a protein skimmer or a nice light, or a controlled heater, which is in the back there. And without that equipment, a nano tank can fluctuate a lot. Things like protein skimmers are going to pull out excess nutrients and make sure the water stays nice and clean. Things like a good light are going to prevent a lot of that nuisance algae growth, such as hair algae, by having the right spectrum. So if you have like a more blue light spectrum for corals, you're probably going to grow less hair algae than if you had like an all white spectrum, for example. And things like that heater are going to regulate the water temperature and keep the metabolism of the reef tank going fast. So things like your cycle are going to be quicker, your corals are going to grow faster, the fish are going to need to be fed more often, all that stuff. And things like a protein skimmer is also going to help balance out that pH by aerating the water and keeping the tank more stable with a pH around 8, especially when combined with this aragonite sand like we have in this tank. So this tank, when compared to our established reef tank, is going to pose a lot of different challenges. So as you can see, this established reef tank is pretty dirty and in need of a clean. This means that we're going to grow a lot more hard to remove algae because this tank is well established. So things like coralline algae are going to encrust on your pumps, your power heads, heaters, any kind of equipment, and you're going to have to clean that probably with something like a distilled vinegar or something that can break down that calcium skeleton, and that way you can scrub the algae off. I normally leave my equipment in distilled vinegar overnight, and then the next day I can just take a toothbrush to it and scrub off any of that nasty algae. Now established tanks like this are going to be a lot more stable with your alkalinity, so your corals are going to look a lot happier like this guy and this guy, and your bacteria in this tank is going to be a lot more established. So you're going to be able to keep corals that you may not have been able to keep in a new tank. For example, these are called zoanthids, if you're not familiar, and there is a larger version of zoanthids called Palithoa, which are a technically different coral but look very similar. Palithoa don't do great in new tanks. I myself tried to keep a Palithoa in a 13-gallon, and when that tank was new, the Palithoa would just melt, and unfortunately that meant that we had no Palithoa in the aquarium. In an established tank though, you can keep Palithoa no problem, and sometimes they even become a bit of a nuisance, like these yellow Palithoas down here. They kind of grow all over the rocks. I have them here, I have them over here, I have them in other tanks where they were on the rocks and transitioned from this tank to that tank, and they just start taking over. Established reef tanks like this as well are going to allow you to keep things like anemones. So these are anemones like you've seen in Finding Nemo, and anemones require a well-established tank. They're very, very finicky. So if you have a new aquarium, anemones will likely just melt. When I say new, I mean like anemones want a 6-month plus old aquarium. So if your aquarium is less than 6 months old, I would not recommend getting an anemone because these guys are $60 to $100 a piece at a fish store normally, and they unfortunately would just melt, and all that money is money lost. So I would say for established reef tanks, anemones are great. but for new reef tanks, anemones are not the go-to. With new reef tanks, I would suggest sticking with corals like this here. This is a toadstool leather. There's also finger leathers, other hardier toadstools that aren't green, for example. These leather corals are going to be super hardy for a new reef tank. They're going to allow you to get your bearings. Some other great corals for new reef tanks are things like star polyps or xenia. Just keep in mind that things like xenia can be a weed, and xenia can just take over your tank pretty quickly. Outside of things like coralline algae and things like the bacteria in the tank, allowing you to keep more finicky corals, well-established reef tanks are going to have the benefit of things just being stable. Like, things will not fluctuate on you. You'll have a well-established reef tank where you know that you need this much filtration, this much carbon, this much filter floss, and you change it on this regular basis. And as long as you don't move or change that schedule, then everything just keeps carrying on the way it always does. The only time things change in an established reef tank is if you change your feeding, you change your food, how you feed, how much you feed, when you feed, you change your filtration, how often you do water changes, all that good stuff, then things will change in the tank. Now, with established reef tanks, I would say the number one mistake is that people overlook water changes. People let water changes go months and months and months without them, and then eventually that results in your corals and, the overall health of your fish and invertebrates and all that declining. On this reef tank, I have probably not done a water change in about 4 weeks now, so it's due for one pretty soon, aka why there's so much algae. So every time I do a water change, I do take a razor blade and scrape down this tank. Now this tank is glass, this tank over here is acrylic, so on acrylic you cannot use a razor blade. On glass, you totally can use a razor blade, just be careful around the silicone. One last thing you may face as a challenge with a well-established reef tank is the consumption of things like magnesium, calcium, alkalinity. All these corals and anemones are going to take and pull that nutrient out of the water. What I mean by that is, in a new reef tank, you might have a coral, right? And that coral may not take that much nutrient out of the water, aka your water changes are probably going to be enough on a new aquarium because you don't have that much of a bioload. Now, as your tank gets older and older, you start having more and more fish, more and more corals. All those corals are going to start pulling calcium out of the water, using up that alkalinity, and you're going to have to start dosing stuff, because unless you're doing water changes every week with a reef salt that has all that nutrient in it, you're going to run into problems where the nutrient level in the tank starts to decline. And if you're not familiar with dosing, or you don't know how to dose your reef tank, you'll start to run into problems. I dose my reef tanks with Alpha Reef, which lets me keep all the parameters stable, but Alpha Reef does require almost daily dosing, maybe every other day, depending on how much corals you have or don't have. And in a new tank, you don't really face that problem because you don't have enough corals to consume that bioload. You don't have enough corals to use up the calcium, right? So your water change, you change your water every couple weeks and your calcium stays pretty stable until your tank is 6 months to a year old, and then all the corals really start to consume those nutrients. You start to lose color in the corals, your corals stop growing, and you start to run into problems until you figure out how to dose. Another problem you can run into with old tanks is if you have established fish in here and then you're adding new fish to this aquarium. So with a new aquarium like this one, you may have 1 or 2 fish in here, and once you have those fish, you have to wait a couple months before you get more. So as long as the 1 or 2 fish you get in the first month or 2 of your aquarium are healthy, then you don't really have to worry about ick or velvet or parasites. That stuff is all kind of either you have it or you don't have it with the fish that you started this aquarium with. Now, in a well-established tank like this one, we've got 3 fish over here, 3 really healthy fish. If I were to add a new fish to this tank without quarantining it, then it could add things like ick or parasites or velvet or something into this aquarium and kill all the fish in here. So you really got to quarantine your fish when you have an established reef tank. What I would suggest, if you have a tank that's more than 2 months old, if you're not quarantining your fish, you really should be. It's one of those things where we recently have taken our old desk mate and made this our quarantine tank. So now we have a 4.8 gallon quarantine. We just do nano fish on this channel, so this should be fine for our needs. But for people that don't have a quarantine tank, you really are risking your fish's health by introducing additional, threats into the tank, like parasites and ick and stuff like that. And there's a good chance that ick is already in your aquarium. It's just that the fish's health is, in its prime. These fish are really healthy and the water quality is really good. So things like ick don't get an opportunity to latch on to these fish and give them health issues. But on a new fish, which is really stressed out, it's gone through shipping to the from the distributor to the aquarium store. If it's not captive bred, it's gone through shipping from like the ocean to the distributor, then the aquarium store, then the drive to your house. So really those fish are as weak as they can be, and in that state of weakness they'll get sick, and then they'll get your other fish sick if you're not quarantining. So my recommendation for a well-established reef tank: keep your bioload low. So you'll see in this well-established tank we have 2 Clarkie clowns and we have a Banggai cardinal. Now these Clarkie clowns are huge. They are nearly full grown. In about another year they'll be full grown clownfish. So in this tank, these 3 fish are plenty of a bioload. Now if you had smaller fish, let's say you had like clown gobies and little tiny fish, you could probably have 5 in here instead of 3. In this tank, it's 9 gallons, so we have 1 clownfish, 1 clown goby, and we also added a high fin goby. Now the high fin goby and the clown goby are very, very small nanofish. They don't really consume much in the way of food, so really the only fish in here that's contributing a lot to the bioload is the clownfish. And in a 9-gallon like this, I would probably say we could get away with like 2 smaller species of clownfish. Like this is an Ocellaris clown, so definitely smaller than my Clarkies. Ocellaris will max out at around 3 inches. Clarkies can definitely hit 5 or 6 inches. So in this tank, I think we're just going to keep 1 clown for now. If we ever do run across another naked clown that's smaller than this one, we might pick it up so we can pair them up, but we'll see. Stay tuned for more. Anyways, guys, those are just my thoughts on old tanks versus new tanks. I think new tanks give you a lot of added benefits where you don't really have to worry as much about the water, but then old tanks are a lot more stable. So as long as you learn how to dose and add calcium, then an old tank becomes much easier to care for than a new tank. But definitely just keep all these things in mind when you're thinking about your reef tank and its age, how much coral you have, how many fish you have, what's going into the tank, what's being pulled out of the tank with water changes, filter media, all that good stuff. If you guys have any thoughts to add, please comment them below, and I'll catch you all on the next one.